So this is the last of the videos in this section on stored procedures. Here we're going to create a function. You're already familiar with functions from other programming languages like C# or Python. It's a chunk of code that you can call as a unit, and generally it will return a value to you. So here we're declaring a function called calc student GPA. So we'll drop it if it doesn't exist, and then we'll go ahead down here and create it. It takes as an argument the student ID. And look, it has a regular return statement here. It returns a decimal 42. That's for GPA. That's 4 digits with 2 to the right of the decimal place. So how does this thing work? Well, inside the stored procedure, inside the function, and this looks a lot like a stored procedure at this point, but it does behave differently. We define our return value, return GPA, and then we set return GPA equals, and here we select the average student GPA for the student, where the student ID matches the value that we're passed in. So we're filtering on the student ID passed in, and we're calculating the average GPA for the student. We store that in this variable, and then we return it at the end. Now, that all looks a lot like a stored procedure, but it's much different in the way it behaves and the way you use it. In a stored procedure, we used a call statement to invoke the stored procedure. And whether or not it was returning a value, we always just called it. But a function is different. In order to use a function, we actually embed it inside of a select statement. So once we've created the function, let me go ahead and run this. Once we've created the function, which I just did, then we can write a select statement where we're passing in for student ID number 2 to get that one person's GPA. So let's run that, and whoever that person is, number 2, we got a GPA of 2.8. If I change this to 3 and run it like so, then I get a GPA of 3.4. Now, that's the simplest possible case, but it's not very useful. It's really just for teaching. A much more useful way of using a function like this is to use it in a select statement where you're selecting a bunch of rows. So take a look at this one. Select last name, first name, calc GPA as GPA from student. So we're going to select every student in the whole table and calc their GPAs. Now, the argument we're passing in is ID, and that comes from the student table. Remember that the primary key of the student table is named ID. So we're passing in for this given row, we're getting the first name of the student, the last name, and we're taking the ID and passing it into the function. It returns the student's GPA, and we're going to display it in the output of the select statement just like another column. So let's run it and see what we get. So here we are. Sanders Janice gets a 3.0, and Bailey Christine gets a 2.8 GPA, and so on. So for all the students across the entire database, we are calculating the student's GPA for everybody. You can't tell looking at the results of this thing that this column, GPA, was not actually stored in any table. It was calculated on the fly by repeatedly calling the calc student GPA for every single student. So this produced about 100 rows of output because there's about 100 students in the college database. So this calc student GPA function got called 100 times and returned the GPA. You can use it like any other column. You know, we could have said order by last name and run it something like this, and we would just order the thing. Or we can do this. Instead of ordering by last name, we'll order by GPA descending. That will put the student with the highest GPA first. Let's go ahead and run it. So we had a couple students with 3.8, and then we went down to 3.77, 3.63, and so on. So the beauty of a function, unlike a stored procedure, is you can embed it in a select statement like this, and then treat it like a piece of data that came right out of a column in a table. Instead of actually being calculated on the fly. And again, if we're producing 1,000 students, we would call the function 1,000 times. Who cares? It does the calculations for us. Notice that it does do a lookup on every one. So there's quite a bit of work being done inside this thing, but it all executes in the blink of an eye because the database manager is so efficient. So that's how you create and use a user function.